Opportunity to welcome everyone to the COG board meeting for February 9th, 2022. We'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. I'm Christian Dorsey, your COG board chair, and I'll be presiding over the meeting. I'd like to thank you all for joining us. I hope you are able to get out during what is probably the best day that we've had in quite a while, but that will have to wait until at least 2 p.m. as we have a very robust meeting in store for you this afternoon. Reminder, since we are joining on this virtual platform yet again, that we ask for your patience in the event of any technical difficulties, but that we also ask for the best participation and for the transmission of this over our streaming channel, that you keep your microphones muted when you are not speaking. When you do wish to speak, please go ahead and unmute your microphone and then return to mute as soon as you are done. And also, as a reminder, we have a chat box that is actively monitored by me and is also by staff. So if you have any comments, questions, or queries, please use the chat box as well and know that it will be monitored. At this time, as we do every month, we'll begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. I'd ask for you to join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Before I get into my initial remarks as part of the chairman's report, Janelle Partman is monitoring the participants box as you all came in. She will now go through and complete the roll call to document everyone's presence at the meeting. Janelle.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. From the District of Columbia, I have Charles Allen, Beverly Perry, and Eugene Kinlow. Is there anyone else from the district? All right, from Maryland, I have Reuben Collins, Michael O'Connor, Denise Mitchell, Robert Wu, Craig Moe, Sydney Harrison, Bridget Donald Newton, Kate Stewart, Joy Schaefer, Keith Sidnor, Richard Madaleno, Ludine McCartney Green, and Tara Jackson. Is there anyone else from Maryland? All right, from Virginia, I have Justin Wilson, Christian Dorsey, Jeff McKay, Rodney Lusk, Dave Snyder, Julie Brisman, Phyllis Randall, Mark Wolf, and Ann Wheeler. Is there anyone else from Virginia?
Penny Gross from Fairfax County.
Thank you, Ms. Gross.
David Meyer from the city of Fairfax.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. All right, Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Partman. I think not only a quorum, but pretty close to a full house. Thank you all for attending today. We very much appreciate it. As a reminder, today's COG meeting is being live streamed or on the COG website through our YouTube account. As I begin, unfortunately, I have to commemorate a sad occasion, and that is the passing of Mayor Kevin Ward from the city of Hyattsville. As you no doubt know, that at the end of toward the end of January, Mayor Ward passed away. We send our condolences to his family as well as to the entire city of Hyattsville community. Mayor Ward served 2 terms on the city council prior to being tapped as interim mayor in early 2021. He then went on to win election later on that spring to serve as the mayor. Now, it has been reported that Mayor Ward died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. And so this is a sobering reminder that it's imperative that if you know someone who you believe may be in danger of committing suicide, that you immediately reach out and try and get help on their behalf. I recommend to all of you the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, which has a web presence, easy to find. They're also available 24 hours a day via phone, 1-800-272-8255. I'm sorry, I don't have a smooth segue to the next order of business, but it is with pleasure that we welcome to the COG board a new member from the Prince George's County Council. It is their chair, Calvin Hawkins. So, Chair Hawkins, are you present
I don't see him yet, Chair Dorsey.
Okay. Well, we welcome Calvin to the COG group, and we look forward to his presence at future meetings. If you attended our in-person annual meeting in December, he is the one who accepted the award on behalf of Derek Davis, who received an award at that time. At this time, I would like to turn the floor over to Mr. Bean for the Executive Director's Report.
Thank you, Chair Dorsey. Just 3 items today. First, I'd like to call on Scott Boggs, who helped facilitate a cybersecurity tabletop exercise. Mr. Boggs?
Thanks, Chuck. Yeah, on January the 20th, we had a cybersecurity tabletop exercise that was actually developed by the chairs of our Chief Information Security Officers, COG staff, and we worked with the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, to develop that. The folks that were invited in actually the target audience was our Chief Administrative Officers, but we also included their Chief Information Officers, Chief Information Security Officers, and emergency managers, as well as a few other selected invitees that the CAOs requested. The topic of that cyber attack was one that had broad implications and impacted multiple jurisdictions in the region. I'd like to say that the conversations were very robust, and many have expressed extreme value in the tabletop exercise and interest in doing something like this again in the future. There were several takeaways that will be outlined in the final documents and shared as appropriate with the staff in the region. As you can imagine, the document will be kept confidential for security reasons. One specific takeaway was related to how we communicate in the region when an attack like this occurs in one of our jurisdictions, and the challenges associated with restrictions that are placed on our jurisdictions by the insurance agencies that carry our policies related to cybersecurity. I will say that I've taken that on as a to-do, is to see if there is a solution to that, because obviously in a situation like this, communicating that the risk occurs is of paramount importance to make sure that we limit the impact of a cyber attack like this. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Chuck.
Thank you. And COG board members can get more information from their CAOs, Chief Information Security Officers participate in that, or may contact me or Scott Boggs. And Scott, if you could put your contact information in the chat, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, will do.
2 recent presentations on the Metropolitan Washington Planning Framework. Earlier this week was with NARC, National Association of Regional Councils. And if you'd like more information about NARC or would like to become more involved with NARC, please let me know. Chair Dorsey is a board member of NARC, and Supervisor Gross is a past chair of the NARC board. So ask any of us more about NARC. For me, it's an opportunity to look at COGs and metropolitan planning organizations across the country. How does Atlanta work? How does Boston work? How does Philadelphia, Chicago work, so that we can bring some of those lessons back to our own programming. Last night, I had the pleasure to be with the City Council of College Park, presenting on the Metropolitan Washington Planning Framework. So talking housing, transit, equity, and climate change with them. Trust with Council Member Mitchell that I did not rile up any citizenry from College Park with any of my remarks last night. A note to the COG board that we have several COG grant and technical assistance funding that is now open. One is the Housing Affordability Planning Program. Staff, let's put a link to that in the chat. Also, a Transportation Land Use Connections Program, or TLC, and a relatively recent funding program called the Roadway Safety Program. So if we could put links in that in the chat. Our most recent podcast on the Metropolitan Washington Planning Framework featured Chair Dorsey, and if staff could provide a link to the podcast in the chat. And for more information on that and the podcast Think Regionally, I'd like to call on Robert Mccartney.
Thanks, Chuck. So I'm Bob Mccartney, and I've been doing this podcast every month since October. I'm really pleased to be doing it. I worked for 39 years at the Washington Post, retired last August. The last 15 years at the Post, I was focused on local news. I was an editor of the Metro section, and I was a columnist for the Metro section. And I also grew up in the area in Bethesda and Chevy Chase, so I have very deep roots here in the region. And working for the Washington Post, you get a perspective. Our perspective in the Metro section of the Post is of the region. I mean, looking at the region as a whole, which is pretty much COG's perspective. So I got very interested in trying to understand what was going on in the greater Washington area as a region, and got very interested and supportive of regional cooperation as a way of addressing the issues, really the only way to effectively address the issue. So I was very pleased to have a chance to do this podcast, which focuses on regional issues and really the main ones that COG is interested in, the ones that Chuck just mentioned: housing affordability, racial equity, access to transit, and climate change and reducing greenhouse gases. And then other issues, obviously, we'll be looking at over time as well. And I'm really hoping to try to focus this on solutions to these problems, and sort of, in the media, we focus a lot on problems. We cover the planes that crash, not the planes that land safely. And so you get a lot of criticism of the media for focusing too much on the negative. Well, now I'm hoping that in this endeavor that I can focus more on solutions and try to call attention to them and promote them. So I really, I hope the podcast will help people in the region to understand issues better from a regional perspective, and also to understand better COG's role in that. I think COG is not, as well understood or as well known in the region as it should be. I thought that when I was a journalist, and I think that now. And I hope that all of the board members on this call and other stakeholders who were involved, will help us and suggest topics and be willing to be interviewed when we call on you. All the podcasts have included at least one interview with an elected official, and I want to give credit to the people who've cooperated. Nancy Navarro from Montgomery County was interviewed for the first podcast in October on racial equity. Then Phyllis Randall from Loudon on high access transit, the importance of having transit near high access transit stations, housing near high access transit stations. Mary Che in December on hunger issues. Christian Dorsey, the most recent one, the current one that's up, sort of looking at the broad agenda for COG in the coming year. And then just this week, I interviewed Justin Wilson from Alexandria about housing issues. Just as you're talking about housing at this meeting, the podcast for February will be on housing affordability. So again, encourage you to suggest topics, welcome your suggestions on how to improve the podcast. Unfortunately, I have to get off this call right after I finish talking, or shortly afterwards, but you can email me or contact people at COG to get in touch with me. I want to thank Chuck Bean for inviting me to do this in the first place, and then COG staffer Steve Kanya from the Communications Office for supervising, and especially Megan Goodman and Janelle Partman for producing the podcast. They have been very helpful, done top quality work, and made it very easy for me. Thanks, Chuck.
Thank you, Bob. There's additional information on COG activities, TBB, MWAC meetings on my written report, which is on page 5 of the board packet. And Chair Dorsey, I'm happy to answer questions, and we have Mr. Boggs and Mr. McCartney here available to answer questions too.
So much, Mr. Bean. Are there any questions for him, Mr. Boggs, or Mr. McCartney? Well, let me just thank you for that report, and thank you, Mr. Boggs, for always keeping your attention on how we can be better coordinated to respond in the event of an emergency. It's something that we don't often like to think about as top of mind, but I'm glad to know that the underlying work continues. And Mr. McCartney, we are very much grateful that in this stage of your career, you're bringing your talents and your perspective to promote and deepen regionalism. I can say, as a subject for one of your podcasts, your incisiveness is really what we need to challenge ourselves and to figure out how we really bring our best game to this important work. So thank you for being on this journey with us. I'm excited about what is to come. All right, we'll move on with our agenda. And our agenda today is primarily focused on housing, as Mr. McCartney alluded to. We're going to have an item where we're going to take a look at our regional housing targets and really get a sense of how jurisdictions are working to progress in realizing the goals of increasing housing supply at various affordability levels. We'll then also have a look at a briefing that's going to cover the fair housing work. That's a COG initiative this year that is going to lay out some themes and policies that can hopefully support jurisdictions in refining their fair housing goals and how that fits within the overall housing strategies that we've outlined. And then we'll look specifically at the multi-family construction sector, take a look at what we've been doing over the last year and over the last decade towards increasing housing supply in that very key sector that's necessary if we're going to deliver the kinds of units that we have envisioned. So housing is our theme for today. We do have another item, but are there any proposed amendments to that agenda? Hearing none, we will now move forward with consideration of the minutes from our January 12th meeting. At any point, I'll entertain a motion for approval of said minutes.
Gross moves approval.
Thank you. Supervisor Gross has moved approval. Is there a second?
Mitchell seconds.
Thank you for the second. First, are there any abstentions? Are there any nay votes? Then these minutes are approved by acclamation. Moving next, we have our consent agenda. And today we have 4 resolutions on our consent agenda, which include a resolution governing staffing of the National Capital Region License Plate Reader Program and the authorization of several studies related to public safety and emergency management. You can find those consent agenda items beginning on page 14 of your board packet. And for reference, these are resolutions R13 through R16, 2022.
Mr. Chairman, Gross moves approval of the consent agenda items.
Thank you. Ms. Gross has moved approval. Is there a second?
Snyder seconds.
Thank
These
you,
are
Mr.
important
Snyder.
items, Mr. Chair, thank you.
Any discussion? All right. Are there any abstentions? Any nay votes? Then our consent agenda is approved, and so with it, resolutions R13 through R16, 2022. We're now ready for agenda item number 7, which is the second quarter financial report for FY22. And I'd like to invite COG Secretary Treasurer Rodney Lusk, along with our Chief Financial Officer, Julie Mussuk, to brief us on fiscal year 22 and second quarter financial results. Mr. Lusk, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I will be very, very brief. For the second quarter financial report for our fiscal year 2022, you will note in your board package, starting on page 17, this findings show the results for the quarter that ended December 31st, 2021. I'm delighted to report that our finances are in a very good state, including the recognition of net surplus from operations. Additionally, this is an interim unaudited report provided by management, and I've had the opportunity to review these financial materials with Ms. Mussuk, who is our Chief Financial Officer here at COG, and would like to turn the program over to her to provide any additional details and answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Good afternoon. The budget for FY22 is to end the year with an $86,400 surplus in undesignated funds. We are on track for that at the end of the second quarter with an undesignated surplus of $95,000 from operations and our $38.7 million operating budget. As of the end of Q2, we also have a surplus of $1.2 million in designated program fund balance, which is also in line with the budget. This surplus is primarily a timing issue where we've collected funds in advance of expenses being recognized. About half the surplus is from the Amazon grant for the Housing Affordability Planning Program. The other half is due to several water and air programs that have received their full funding for the year in advance of budgeted spending. Operating revenues and expenses are tracking lower to the FY22 budget at 42%, but higher than the mid-year totals for the prior year. Revenues are generally higher in the second half of the fiscal year, so this is in large part a timing issue, and we do expect to track closer to the FY22 budget by year end. Lower federal and state revenue year to date compared to budget is driven by lower spend in the Transportation Planning Board work program and commuter connections. These are cost reimbursable projects, so the year to date expenses are also lower than the budget, and total operating expenses are tracking at about 39% of the budget at this point. Commuter connection spend on advertising is lower than the budget, but significantly higher than the prior year, reflected of the current COVID-19 environment. And depending on COVID limitations, spends on advertising may not rise to the budgeted level for this fiscal year. One major variance is on the statement of revenue, expense, and change in net position is in recipient pass-through funds, which are at 24% of the budget. A significant portion of the subrecipient pass-through funds budgeted are for enhanced mobility projects that have not yet been recognized, but are expected to total around $5.7 million for the fiscal year. This is a bit lower than what was budgeted, but still we will be coming in much closer to the total budget. In addition, pass-through funds for an Amtrak repower project that were in the budget for FY22 have not been received yet, but the expectation is these funds will be in place once a vendor is selected for the project, since the funding was approved by the funding agency in December of 2020. The statement of net position as of December 31, 2021 shows an overall increase in net position of $2.2 million. The increase reflects the impact of the increase year over year in the restricted fund balances. Overall, COG remains financially healthy and board designated reserves are 100% funded. At this point, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Musak and Mr. Lusk. Are there any questions about the report? For those who are new to these COG reports, the essential takeaways are good. We have fully funded reserves. Any decreased revenues from what we were expecting are reflected in decreased spend on the operations side. So things are in balance and what we generally expect. So seeing no questions, we thank you both for that report, and we're ready to move on with our agenda to item number 8. And this is where we'll take a look at our regional housing targets. And today we are joined by our Community Planning and Services Director, Paul Desjardins, who will give us a brief update on overall efforts to reach our housing targets. Then we will have a wonderful opportunity for a listen and learn with Prince George's County Deputy Chief Administrative Officer for Economic Development, Angie Rogers, and Mayor of the City of Alexandria, Justin Wilson, on their experiences and lessons learned from efforts to increase their jurisdiction's housing supply and affordability. So I will now turn it over to Mr. Desjardins.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My role is actually very simple. I'm going to walk through a few points and really set the table for a very detailed series of presentations and conversations that you'll be hearing subsequently to me. Janelle, if you could advance to the next slide, please. So a quick refresher, and again, for the benefit of new board members, as Chairman Dorsey mentioned, this is our framework, the 3 targets that we established in 2019 that are the basis for our housing work. Very quickly, again, adding 75,000 additional housing units beyond what we are currently anticipating, placing 75% of all net new housing within activity centers or near high capacity transit. And then lastly, affordability. 75% of all those new housing units in the region should be affordable to low and moderate income households. Next slide, please, Janelle. So beginning in 2019, with the adoption of our targets, a number of jurisdictions locally adopted their own targets, which you see here. The district was the first, and you see a representation of the district's framework for equity and growth as it relates to housing in that chart there. As you mentioned, Mr. Dorsey, in a moment, we'll be hearing more recent updates from Ms. Rogers and Mayor Wilson about their respective efforts in Prince George's and Alexandria. Next slide, please. But this is also an initiative that calls for partnerships. And here are three examples from the private sector and philanthropy that I would really call to your attention. First and foremost, Amazon's Housing Equity Fund of more than $2 billion to support financing for affordable homes throughout the country. In our region, there have been a couple of specific projects that have benefited directly from financing from the Housing Equity Fund, including our HAP program, which I'll mention again in a minute. Kaiser Permanente has also stepped up, adding more than $2 million specifically to support efforts to address homelessness in the region, helping to forestall evictions, but also at the height of COVID to provide PPEs and COVID-19 testing, as you see there. And then lastly, we'd want to call to attention one of our strategic partners, the Greater Washington Community Foundation, who has established their partnership to end homelessness. And as you see, there are a number of key areas that they are focused on with increasing the supply of deeply affordable housing, but also trying to strategically leverage private sector investment in addressing this issue region-wide. This is a topic that will also be addressed, the homeless issue will be addressed at our May board meeting when we do our annual assessment of the point-in-time count. Next slide, please. Again, this is a slide that we shared with you at the outset of our journey on the housing targets. The red reference line at top is the 32,000 units per year that is our target for housing production to meet our housing goals. The blue line below is the number of building permits that are actually being approved. And again, for the last decade, we've actually only been approving about 23 to 24,000 units on average throughout that time period. But I will point out, and you'll hear later on today, a bright spot, particularly as it relates to multifamily rental housing construction and the number and location of those units. Next slide, please. I alluded to this before. Again, one of our action steps, the Housing Affordability Planning Program. We've mentioned this to the board a couple of times. The grant proposal period has opened. We're getting abstracts as we speak. The applications are due in March. As you see, again, this is $75,000 competitively awarded grants to support the production or preservation of affordable housing in places around the region, particularly near high-capacity transit stations. Next slide, please. This will also be the next item on your agenda. For more than 2 years, 8 of the major COG jurisdictions in the region have been on a journey together to develop a regional analysis of the impediments to fair housing. What you'll be hearing in a little while are some of the preliminary findings and recommendations that will be brought back to your boards for local action. Again, you'll be hearing more about this initiative in the next agenda item. Then next slide, please. And then lastly, many of the board members remember from about 1.5 years ago with Dr. Tiffany Manuel, we published the new narrative for housing, a series of messaging tools and ideas to really convey to the region as a whole that housing really is a critical asset and affordable housing is a key challenge to our region's economic quality of life and health. With that, Mr. Chairman, I will pause and turn to Ms. Rogers so she can brief us on the work within Prince George's County.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Angie Rogers. I'm the Deputy CAO for Economic Development for Prince George's County. I have the privilege of serving in the administration for County Executive Angela Also Brooks. And my job is to translate our 498 square miles into meaningful economic development. And that is jobs, amenities, and housing. Last June, County Executive Also Brooks announced her economic development platform during her State of the County address. Next slide. Our economic development platform is anchored by a set of goals that we hope will guide how the county grows over time and how we measure our progress. Next slide. Lots of people think economic development in the county is just the work of our Economic Development Corporation and our Financial Services Corporation, all business development and corporate attraction and small business support. But that is only one part of our work in the economic development cluster. And this is one of the things we wanted to, excuse me, make clear with this new platform. We wanted to set a more holistic vision for economic development in the county that focuses on commercial growth, but is also focused on principles that we are all trying to achieve these days: sustainability, diversity, health, equity, and access. Next slide. There were some things in our platform that probably weren't surprising to anyone. Our goals to grow good paying jobs, to increase our commercial tax base, to decrease low income, low access areas, commonly known as food deserts. There were a few things, though, that might have been surprising. That we set a goal to grow population, particularly in our transit-oriented development areas. That we are focusing on placemaking as a specific economic development strategy. Next slide. The most surprising to most people was probably that we set an affordable housing goal for the county. And here I will repeat something the county executive said in last year's State of the County address, and I've been repeating ever since. We do not get to have quality economic development without affordable housing. While Prince George's County is one of the wealthiest majority African-American communities in the country, what we know is that that wealth and indeed how those African-American and other households of color access it is very different from what this looks like in neighboring jurisdictions that are majority white. We know that the relative greater affordability of multifamily rental in Prince George's is a result of disinvestment more than anything else. So the housing is cheaper, but it's also lower quality. We know that the general devaluation in both housing and commercial prospects means that the county hasn't had the same resources to address these issues. We know that this disinvestment leading to lower quality has made community support for affordable multifamily housing a difficult prospect in the county. And finally, we know that even with these dynamics, Prince George's is not immune to the same pressures we have seen in the rest of the region. Many of you have probably taken a look at HAND's HIT tool data. And we can see from that data that Prince George's County is second only to Montgomery County in the growth of median rent between 2013 and 2019. So all of that naturally occurring affordable housing that many think we have enough of is actually disappearing at a pretty fast clip. The truth is we are less competitive for growing jobs and our commercial tax base without housing that serves a range of incomes. If we built a new hospital and the doctors can afford to live in Prince George's County, but the receptionist and the phlebotomist and the janitors have to drive from Western Maryland to get here, then we have failed. So, as part of our vision, we set specific housing goals. Next slide. Taking our cues from the COG housing targets, we set goals to build 26,000 new units by 2030, 75% of which would be affordable, to preserve 6,000 existing affordable units, and to build 10,400 new multifamily units. Next slide. I also want to give a nod to our anchor initiative for the new platform and our new goals. The Blue Line Corridor, which runs from Capitol Heights Metro out to downtown Largo, and including Central Avenue or Maryland 214. This is our next big opportunity to focus on all of our goals and to really create a model for place-based economic development that we hope we can replicate in other places throughout the county. Next slide. The county has an abundance of opportunity, as I said, 498 square miles of it. But when it comes to our public resources and when it comes to determining where we incentivize to meet the county's core economic development goals, we need to focus on an opportunity that can be a catalyst and demonstration for what we want to see across the county. And we think the Blue Line Corridor is that opportunity. Next slide. There are many who wonder why we would focus on housing when the county has so much of it. As we grow, our housing needs are going to grow. And from my perspective, housing is necessary infrastructure, just like health facilities, transportation, education. And we need to have that housing across a range of incomes to support the jobs and commerce that we want to have in the county. But also because neighborhoods that support diversity in all forms, including incomes, are the healthiest and most sustainable neighborhoods. In our region, where an imbalance of jobs, housing, and transportation anywhere stresses our entire ecosystem, it's important for all of us to do our part. This new economic development platform is an exciting contribution for Prince George's County, we think, and we look forward to continuing to check in with this body, to collaborate, and also to be held accountable for making progress. So thank you all for allowing me to speak today about our efforts in Prince George's County. And Chairman Dorsey, I'll hand it back to you.
Ms. Rogers, thank you so very much. That was very much a welcome presentation, and we thank you all so much for finding the COG targets useful in developing your strategic plan for economic development. It is now my pleasure to welcome to the virtual podium Mayor Wilson from the City of Alexandria. Take it away, Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I believe you can see my slides, hopefully.
We can.
Great, very good. Thank you very much. Let me, first of all, I had the unlucky pleasure of following Ms. Rogers, who did a great job of covering, and I think you'll see a lot of commonality between some of the work we are doing across the region. I think Ms. Rogers had it exactly right, that ultimately our inability in the past to provide the housing supply necessary to support the job growth that we want to come to this region is going to become an inhibitor to economic development in this region if we do not address it. And so that's why I think the work that COG has done, Mr. Chairman, you and several of your predecessors have led to make sure this issue stays on the forefront is so essential. COG has been an essential, indispensable convener of dealing with this issue in that it is a regional issue. It is not an issue that any one of us can take on our own. For us in Alexandria, you know, this COG, there we go, sorry. This COG housing effort really came at a perfect time. You know, as our community was grappling with the impact of Amazon and Virginia Tech, and trying to understand those impacts, it gave us the opportunity to move very, very quickly and very much in the public interest to address these challenges. We were obviously, as all of us were, very involved in the housing target effort. And after the board adopted in September 19, we started a process within the city to have a conversation about how we would accommodate these targets in what we were already doing as a community. I think the first step for us was we have been doing really 2 decades of planning in our growth corridors in figuring out how we accommodate growth throughout our city. That has been something that very much rhyming with what COG has been doing. We plan growth for adjacent to the transportation infrastructure we already have, as well as the planned transportation infrastructure, future BRT lines, existing BRT lines, as well as metro stations. And in there, we have well over 40 million square feet of additional housing that is approved in small area plans, but not ultimately come to fruition. The city had planned in that in those efforts for, and I think what our COG cooperative forecast showed is about 8,400 housing units between now and 2030. COG asked us to up our game and get us to 11,500, which is an additional 3,100, 2,250 of which would be affordable committed units. For us, we have already started to turn the corner. From 14 to 19, we were creating about 840 units a year. We're now at 1,105, and I'm excited to say that we are on track to meet the COG target by 2030. You know, for us, this is not new in making these commitments. Back in 2013, the city approved a housing master plan that put a whole bunch of tools in our toolkit and enshrined for us a desire to make sure that this is a community that could be accessible for all, and making sure that housing is adjacent to transit, jobs, and the services that we expect. And that, of course, aligned very closely with what we've talked about previously at this body, our racial and social equity initiatives, and making sure that those are a foundational effort for our housing effort. Back when we approved that housing master plan in 2013, we had actually set a goal of 2,000 units by 2025. And we are very much on track to make that goal and achieve what we had originally laid out. So really, as we were kind of wrapping up our housing commitments that we had made in 2013, the COG effort came at a perfect time. Because we were basically able to say, okay, what's next? And COG, I think, gave us a great framework of what that would look like, adding additional 2,250 units to the mix by 2030. And in March of 2020, the City Council unanimously endorsed a resolution that adopted these housing targets as our goals, the COG targets as the goals for the city. And I was proud that we were, as you saw earlier in the slide, the 3rd jurisdiction in the region to take that step. We are now working to make sure that we have the tools and toolbox to make that happen. But obviously, just like everyone, we hit the pandemic back 2 years ago. And we had to shift some of our attention to addressing the emergent housing needs, just like everyone, to keep folks housed, keep roofs over their head, provide the regulatory flexibility and financial support to make sure that our community stabilized during the pandemic. But we did not stop moving forward during that process, and we continued the urgent work of making sure that we move forward on meeting these goals. We've also been working to enhance that toolbox. As I said, we added an accessory dwelling unit ordinance back in 2020. We just last month adopted a new co-living ordinance, which tries to make sure that we enshrine some of these non-traditional living arrangements in our zoning code. We're continuing work on an enhanced inclusionary zoning policy, probably be down in Richmond asking for additional authority. And we created a new zoning tool that we have now used once, and on Saturday we're going to be considering whether we use it a second time, called our residential multifamily zone, which was just awarded an Urban Land Institute National Award for Best Housing Policy. approach, which very much is making explicit the implicit trade of substantial density to preserve or produce additional deeply affordable housing. And we're just getting started with using that tool, and we've been proud of the types of results that it's enabled us to achieve. You know, we're going to continue to look at our local policies and make sure they are aligned to providing the kind of housing preservation and creation that we're looking for in our community. Obviously, this takes money. This takes local resources, as well as was mentioned in Paul's presentation, some of the private resources that are available. We have a portion of our meals tax, 1% of our meals tax, that goes directly into our capital improvement program to fund housing creation. We have also worked to use the Amazon funds that came from the Commonwealth to help incentivize Amazon to come here, the housing funds. We've worked with JBG Smith's social impact. We've worked with Amazon. We've worked with a lot of other entities to provide resources, to weave the resources necessary to do the preservation and creation that we know is necessary. You know, in every small area plan we have approved in recent years, we have made sure that that we up the game in what we're expecting out of housing for the future, making sure that it is a core expectation of new development when it comes forward. And we've seen, here's an opportunity to look at some of the current projects that have recently been approved in the shadow of Amazon, our largest affordable housing project ever, with 20% of deeply affordable, 40% of area median income units. Purchase of a property where we used JBG Smith's social impact funds, as well as local funds, not only to preserve housing that was threatened, but also to do some land banking for the future. And on Saturday, we're going to be considering Parkview 2, which is a development adjacent to a property we actually purchased or worked with a nonprofit to help finance a purchase back in 2006. And we're going to be working to expand on that site and adding over 200 additional new affordable units, as well as some ownership efforts we've done as well. I want to close with just talking about some of the challenges here as well. Obviously, the availability of resources is going to continue to be an issue for us all. I think, and I want to emphasize, the third bullet is perhaps the most important. We have to sustain community support and make sure our community is engaged with this process from the beginning. You know, there are a lot of sad stories from around the country where folks have gotten ahead of that community process, and I think we need to make sure we remain in sync in demonstrating the impact of this for economic growth, for racial equity, for the accessibility of all of our communities. So thank you very much for COG, for the work that they are doing. We look forward to continuing to be a part of this conversation and working with our colleagues regionally to make progress. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayor Wilson. And again, Ms. Rogers, for sharing what are just comprehensive approaches to dealing with this sticky issue. You're really providing a model for the rest of us in the region. And we thank you so much for your sharing your progress and your assessment of the challenges with us this afternoon. Before I open the floor to discussion, I do want to make note that we have many success stories and indicators of progress moving forward from throughout the region. We certainly did not have time for all of them today, but I will note just a couple. In 2021, the District of Columbia Council made historic and transformative investments in housing and housing stability by leveraging federal recovery funds in not only affordable housing production, but ensuring that shelters could be maintained in a state of good repair and other improvements to public housing. Recently, in Fairfax County in Virginia, the Board of Supervisors approved millions of dollars in financial support that is going to create 175 affordable units in the Tysons Corner area. So again, the nexus of housing and transit. And in Arlington County, my own jurisdiction, we will consider as a board on Saturday the approval of an infill development that is made possible by action we took last year to eliminate height restrictions in a residential zoning district so long as the housing that was proposed was 100% affordable. So we removed height limitations in our districts, and we got a proposal for a 100% affordable project, which will create a four-fold increase in allowable density, and will ultimately create about 455 units in walking distance to the Roslyn Metro Station. So there are many more examples of good work that's being done in the region. And at this point, I would love to facilitate a discussion among board members with any questions from Ms. Rogers, Mayor Wilson, Mr. Desjardins. Please signify your interest to speak. Use the hands function, use the chat, or just gesticulate wildly and we'll figure it out. All right, I see Tim Adams, I see Phyllis Randall, and I see Rodney Lusk, and then we'll reconsider after that.
Hey, thank you so very much. First and foremost, I thought the presentations were great. There's more of a comment than a question I'd like to make, and that is one of the things we've done in the city of Bowie and Prince George's County, but I think is also helpful, is that when we look at our affordable housing and our workforce housing, that we made sure that with any developments that we do, that we don't just single them out and have them just set apart from developments as they've done. We've worked at making sure that we try to include in our major developments that we also have the workforce and the affordable housing mixed in with the other end, the higher end of the home, so that we don't end up with just having a section or a corner that's affordable housing or workforce housing versus the rest of the development, but that we incorporate it all together. And so I think that's something to keep in mind as we move forward when we talk about how we're going to handle affordable housing, workforce housing, and just make sure that we don't end up just making them separate from the developments that we do overall. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor Adams. Okay. I think I recognize Chair Randall and then Mr. Lusk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So two things. One, well, three things maybe. To Mr. Adams' statement, I completely agree with him. The issue is if you're going to build in Virginia, at least with LIHTC funding, then the LIHTC funding units all have to be one unit. It has to be in one building, and that becomes a problem for the very reason he just said. But I have two questions. One, can people tell me if they're putting, when Mr. Wilson talked about putting your own money in, Loudoun is implementing a 0.5 cents tax per $100 of assessed value, which will yield us only about $6 million to go to our housing trust fund. But it's the first time we've ever done that before, so it's a good start. So I'm wondering what other counties are doing toward their housing trust fund. That's the first question. And my second question is that the presentations were excellent, but I didn't hear a lot about affordable homes for purchase. And what we know, of course, is home ownership builds generational wealth. And so how are people doing, or are they having any successes with affordable homes or other unmet housing need homes for purchase and not just for rent? Thank you.
All right. So to orchestrate, I think, Ms. Randall, we can provide a summary of kind of like the way various jurisdictions go about funding trust funds or other similar vehicles, and we can make sure that that's made broadly available to everyone.
Sure.
And then for the purposes of your question, I think I saw on one of Mayor Wilson's slides about a home ownership project. So why don't I start off with you and then Ms. Rogers can follow. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the home ownership front, we have done committed home ownership units as well, with deed restrictions that allow for the homeowners to receive the benefit of home ownership. We actually just approved a brand new project a couple of months ago on Seminary Road that is providing that kind of model. It is trickier to make those projects happen, but we certainly seek those out where we can. We also had some set-aside homeownership units come as part of some new development recently in Potomac Yard as well. As to your question around finances, we did have in place for a long time, a real estate tax dedication that we scaled back a little bit during the Great Recession, but still maintain a portion of that today. And then, as I mentioned, we have the dining tax revenue, and then we have revenue that comes from development for folks who are not bringing on-site units. They pay into to the fund as well, and we use those resources to leverage in partnership with LIHTC and nonprofits and a lot of other funding to make things happen.
Thank you. Ms. Rogers, anything that you'd like to add at this point?
Sure. I'll just add that on the funding front, our county council took steps last year to provide a sustainable funding source for our Housing Investment Trust Fund to do a portion of deregulation and transfer taxes to that fund every year. So that's going to be key for us moving forward. We have also, like some of the other jurisdictions, taken opportunities to use our ARPA funds to create more funding streams for particularly preservation efforts in the county. We do focus on affordable homeownership as well, but I will say for us, the place where we really need the focus and really need the attention is affordable multifamily rental. And so that is not to the exclusion of home ownership for us, but it's just a place where we haven't focused in the county and we need to focus, and particularly around our metro stations. I will also just say to your first point, and we can sort of provide some examples later if it's helpful, but there are structures where you can include LIHTC in mixed income developments. I won't go into it, but there are structures where you can do that. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much. Okay, we'll go to Mr. Lusk.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll make one comment and have one question. The comment is, I do appreciate this nexus between economic development and affordable housing. And I'll make the point, while I worked in Fairfax County for a number of years in economic development, many of the companies that we would be talking to would be asking us specifically, what opportunities are there for affordable housing for our workers? That became a critical point of their analysis and in their decision making as to whether or not they wanted to consider Fairfax County or some other place. So I appreciate that this is like at the very epicenter of the decision making as well. And then the question is for, I guess, Mayor Wilson and then also probably Ms. Rogers. Just curious to know, in terms of use of public land to build affordable housing, what's been your success in your respective jurisdictions in being able to do that? Because I think that's a really good tool to help buy down, some of the costs is to, start with public land. So just out of curiosity, wanted to hear what's your success been with that.
Thank you, Mr. Lusk, for those questions. And if each of you could just provide an illustrative example, I know you've got multiple ones, but our time is running short. So how about we start off with Ms. Rogers this time?
Sure. I'll say we don't have a formal policy for using public land for affordable housing like the district does, but we have used some of the developments through our redevelopment authority and our revenue authority to deploy public land for that use. We are also looking to operationalize in the next year a land banking pilot that would take advantage of some of our public land parcels for affordable housing.
Thank you.
I'll just give a great example. 20 years ago, the city bought an office building, a derelict office building in Arlandria, knocked it down, put a parking lot there for 20 years. Just a couple of weeks ago, we approved that property as part of an affordable housing development that is going to be constructed very soon. So we land banked and now use the property for affordable housing developments. We're pretty excited about that.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you both. All right, I'll now turn to Vice Chair Stewart for the last question on this topic before we move on. But since this is housing theme, I'm sure you can wrap your questions if they were unanswered into a future agenda item. Mayor Stewart.
Thank you. And actually, I just wanted to come back to Ms. Randall's question on home ownership and lift up some things that I know other jurisdictions are doing and we're doing in Tacoma Park, just to throw it in the mix. But we have, when someone, an owner is going to put up for sale a multifamily building, and sometimes these are our smaller, we have first right of refusal for the tenants as well as the city. And we've been able to assist tenants in purchasing their home, also coupling this with a down payment assistance program. Because we know sometimes it's that down payment because of a lack of generational wealth that can really be a barrier. In addition, the city has also sometimes purchased the home through our first right of refusal and then worked with nonprofit partners like Habitat for Humanity or HIP, the Housing Initiative Partnership. And we're doing a project now where they're taking a multifamily, what was a multifamily building, and actually creating 2 homes that they'll use, as Mayor Wilson talked about, sort of a deed restricted limited equity project, so that we have affordable home ownership in the community. And as Mr. Adams said, doing it in the mixed into the community, so that you have homeowners at different income levels throughout. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Vice Chair Stewart. And whenever someone brings up first right of refusal authorities, those of us who are leaders in the Commonwealth of Virginia just seethe with envy and anger, but we'll leave it at that. And thank you, Mayor Wilson and Angie Rogers. Wonderful way to start off our peer exchange and learning, parts of our COG meetings. You all have set a high bar. We thank you very much. And glad to have you doing the work that you're doing. We'll move on to agenda item number 9. And here we're going to be led by our housing program manager, Hillary Chapman, who is going to brief us on the forthcoming draft regional housing equity plan to help local governments meet their fair housing requirements through regional collaboration. Ms. Chapman will be joined by members of the consultant team. They include a District of Columbia Housing Compliance Officer, Leslie Edmond, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, Fair Housing and Community Development Project Director, Diane Glauber, and Enterprise Community Partners Senior Director of Strategy and Implementation, Jared Elwell. Afterward, the board will be asked to provide input on a set of draft regional goals. Otherwise, there is no action associated with this item today. We'll turn it over to Ms. Chapman.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Chairman Dorsey and members of the board. I'm thrilled to be here with you this afternoon to share an update on an important multi-year process to move the needle on housing equity in our region. If we could just go to the next slide. I'm honored to be here with several members of the team. You've just heard. I also want to share and acknowledge that Manuel Ochoa from Ochoa Urban Collaborative, who is our community engagement lead, is also on the line, along with Peter Tatian from the Urban Institute, who, along with Monique King-Veland, is a co-principal in the plan's data collection and analysis work. So before we get started, I want to publicly acknowledge and thank the members of the 8 local participating governments for their dedication and hard work for years now to make a difference in our efforts to improve housing choice and opportunity in our region. These include in Maryland, Montgomery County and the city of Gaithersburg, the District of Columbia, and in Virginia, the city of Alexandria, Arlington County, Fairfax County, Loudoun County, and Prince William County. And of course, HUD representatives from the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, which has supported this collaboration without wavering since day one. We'll start with a quick review of what this plan is and where we are in the collaboration timeline. Next, we'll hear from Leslie Edmond, who will share her local government perspective on this effort. Following that, we'll share 5 draft regional goals, and we'll invite you to provide input before these goals are shared publicly in a full draft plan. And we'll conclude with insights from Jared Elwell, who will share his perspective working on regional fair housing plans nationwide, before providing some additional information on next steps and how to stay engaged in this process. So for those of you who are not already familiar, I'd like to provide a very brief explanation on what the Regional Housing Equity Plan is. So this is also known by its HUD name, the Analysis of Impediments to Fair Housing Choice. And this is a plan typically covering 5 years, and you can see described here, which is designed to develop meaningful actions to overcome historic patterns of segregation, promote fair housing choice, and foster inclusive communities free from discrimination. Once fully approved at the local and federal level by HUD, it will guide local investment decisions of federal funds to achieve the goals outlined in the plan. The key elements of the plan are listed here, and it's important to note that in this process, we have been very focused on not only having a robust community engagement process, but also ensuring that our data collection and analysis will be tied in a direct way to actions to remedy those findings. Next slide, please. This is a quick overview of the project timeline. It has been an eventful multi-year process, 25 years in the making. We encountered some setbacks during the period of January 2018 through July 2020. However, I'd like to direct your attention to where we are now at the far right end of the arrow. We will review the schedule once more at the end of our remarks to ensure that you have information about future opportunities to provide input on the plan. And now I will hand it over to Leslie Edmond from the District of Columbia to share her perspective about why it's important to work on fair housing together as a region.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Hillary, for that introduction. As you can see here on the slide, it has been a long journey. It's been 25 years since the last regional AI was done, but we have done it. I want to recognize Hillary for her dedication, give her a little bit of applause for her due diligence. She has kept the trains running through this. As you can see, the AFFH rule started in 2015 in the Obama administration when it was published, and we began talking about doing a regional effort literally as soon as the rule change came out. So long story short, this has roots all the way back to 2015 to start this collaboration and to keep it moving. And so although this study and project has been in place since then and spanned 3 federal administrations, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the roots of this initiative during Black History Month, that it really goes back 54 years ago to the events that led to the passage of the Fair Housing Act. The catalyst was the assassination of Dr. King and the civil unrest that occurred in all those years prior to the passage of the act and even after passage of the act. It's very important to talk about this now, considering where we all are as a region, because even today, there are several parts of DC that recently have recovered from those riots in the last 20 years. And I personally am a resident of one of those neighborhoods that was affected directly by the riots. That's gotten investment as a result of the city working together with our partners in the community. There was white flight, there was Black flight out of the city as a result of all those riots that occurred from 1963 to 1968. And so again, here we are in a time of unrest, a national public health emergency, but we have remained steady to move this initiative forward during this health emergency. And, it just highlights the interconnectedness of our region. As Ms. Rogers mentioned earlier, we are all part of the same ecosystem. Our economies are linked together. I know you guys all know this. And this is part of a coordinated effort where people don't necessarily think about what boundaries they're going through in between Tacoma Park, moving into Montgomery County, or going from Hyattsville, into DC, and the same with Montgomery County and even Prince George's County. So we've been going through a lot of flux in the last 2 years, but we have held fast to getting this effort done. And so when you look back at that previous slide where Hillary was talking about the 2015 implementation of the FFH rule, that's what it's known for. So there's a lot of acronyms when we talk about fair housing and HUD in this effort. There's been a lot that's been going on. And unfortunately, this effort got caught up in some of those transitions through federal administrations. It got rolled back early on in the previous administration under President Trump. Then towards the end of the administration, again, there was another rule change. And now HUD is currently working at revisiting those rules. And so as a result of that, we were tasked with doing this housing equity plan. So that's the way we've been referring to it But essentially, we are doing this report consistent with an analysis of impediments of fair housing choice, which was the previous rule, but we also try to honor the spirit of the AFFH rule. So I think we've done a great job, moving forward despite the limbo, working together through interagency and intergovernmental collaborations, because every city is different, every jurisdiction, a county, a town, but we pushed through, we're able to show that we work together as one economy, one ecosystem. So lastly, before we move on, I just wanted to take a moment to look back, because of course we got to look back to move forward. And Mayor Bowser in 2019 issued her first housing order, and that was the first one that was ever done in the city. But in that housing order, she set housing production goals, which also included affordable housing. But she also included the completion of the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. So we completed our first draft for DC of that report in late 2019. That document was updated, and it's going to be updated through this regional initiative as well. Sorry, of course, you get a delivery when you're doing a WebEx, right? So additionally, the work done through this housing equity report that was part of that effort, we identified we needed to have more affordable housing west of Rock Creek Park. And last week, the mayor announced a project cited in Ward 3. That's one of the first ones that we've ever had for affordable housing. And, DHCD has been the lead agency in implementing the recommendations of our previous analysis of impediments going back to 2011. And so as a result of that, we've implemented recommendations in our RFPs to create points for higher opportunity neighborhoods that result in us selecting a project in Ward 3. So we've changed our scoring. We've taken an opportunity to work with the Office of Planning. We've also worked with DCRA and the Office of Zoning to make sure we have equitable access to housing choices for our residents. So the last point I just want to remind you guys is that as of now, since December 2021, we have produced, not as of December 21, but this data is of December 21. Since January of 2019, 20,603 units have been produced, of which 3,590 have been affordable. And since 2015, we have invested $1 billion in the Housing Production Trust Fund to help produce affordable units in order to reach our 36,000 production goal by the year 2025. So Hillary, thank you for giving me this opportunity to let you know where we are in DC, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Diane.
Good afternoon. Leslie didn't tell you who worked on the DC plan, but it was the Lawyers Committee. So we're so happy to continue this work in the region. I probably have talked to more of you in the last month or so than I've ever thought, and I can't thank you enough for your wisdom, your insights, and it really helped with shaping a great plan. And Hillary, whom I did not know before this process, is now on speed dial. So let's get into it. There's been discussion already today about the need for the increase in affordable housing, right? I'm preaching to the choir here. Some of our strategies will be targeting maybe lower income, maybe having fewer units, but having more depth of subsidy, because people that have 30, 40, 50, 60% of median income have virtually no choices. And they're the ones that are affecting economic development. We heard earlier a great presentation. And if you can't hire workers at your sub shop or your gas station, it's going to really impact your business. We heard ADUs mentioned, and kudos to those that are already implementing it. One of our thoughts was to provide, incentivize by providing maybe grants to homeowners to be able to create an ADU. And for those homeowners who are willing to rent to somebody up to 80% of median, maybe provide some grants to incentivize this. The advantage of ADUs, of course, is that it's not like huge new lot of construction, and it's also usually in higher opportunity areas where there are single family zoning. So we also will be discussing some of the best practices. You've heard them, besides ADUs, you know, we've talked about setting aside land by jurisdictions for affordable housing, maybe expediting permitting and review, looking at parking requirements, maybe lessening them for affordable housing developments. There's a laundry list that I will not share with you now, but it will be in the plan. Then you can't talk about affordable housing and zoning, and I've spoken to a number of you about zoning. I understand the restrictions, certainly in Virginia, but there are some carve-outs, which is nice. We would like to see increasing inclusionary zoning incentives to create on-site rather than paying for an paying off-site, like going to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, because the advantage of that is that mixed income. It's in, usually these new developments are in higher opportunity areas. As we heard, there are certainly ways to finance that. Looking at adopting affordable housing overlay zones to increase the land suitable for affordable housing development, and that could be near transit. A number of jurisdictions are already doing that. Incorporating a fair housing equity analysis into the review of rezoning proposals and specific plans. And we have models we can share with you where other jurisdictions have been able to do that. And that will reduce displacement and, you know, really give a analytic vision to making sure members of protected classes are not, you know, disadvantaged by these new developments. Preservation. Certainly, I've talked to a number of you and of course many others about expiring subsidy contracts. And it's disheartening to think back in the day when tax credits first came online and some of the older HUD programs first came online, that there was no right of first refusal to either the city or the jurisdiction or nonprofits. And I hate to see those units just disappear, but many units are in danger of disappearing. So maybe prioritizing some of the funding to maintain the affordability. I heard the right of first refusal, and those, I guess, not in Virginia or willing to maybe shake things up in Virginia. You know, manufactured homes are really sort of the last market rate affordable housing. And we would like to see right of first refusal for these so that residents can purchase the land and run it as a cooperative. I don't know if you've heard of Rock USA, which is resident-owned cooperatives. There are many examples around the country of these being self-governed, self-managed, or managed by a nonprofit. But I know in a number of jurisdictions, there is some mobile home parks for sale, which will certainly impact those residents. Protecting individuals you know, promoting their housing rights. We've talked to a number of tenants, a number of people really struggling. And one of our suggestions is eliminating fees for voucher holders seeking apartments, because we hear, even though all the regions have source of income protections, meaning that they landlords have to accept housing vouchers, we know in practice they don't. So that's another issue, but we'd like to see that landlords accept vouchers or have no application fees to encourage these individuals to find appropriate housing, because the $50, which is a cap in Virginia, could be a real disincentive to apply for a lot of housing. We also, HUD has some good criminal background screening. You know, we've heard of stories of people being denied housing because they have a 10-year-old shoplifting charge, or in fact, they were just arrested and never convicted. And we'd like to see landlords follow the HUD guidelines as well as the housing authorities. I've talked about right to counsel to some of you. In fact, Maryland just passed legislation last year for a right to counsel program, which provides lawyers to tenants facing eviction by landlords. Landlords almost always have a lawyer with them. Tenants almost never have a lawyer with them. And it's been shown time and time again in places like New York and San Francisco and Philadelphia that if you go to court with the lawyer, you have a much better outcome. So we'd like to see maybe piloting that. We'd also like to see Maryland actually contribute money to that, which they haven't really done robustly. I have heard very consistently that both tenants and even government officials don't know where to send people that are having fair housing issues. Until recently, the state of Virginia has done a good job with their program, but a number of the attorneys were recently let go. And I really think it's important for jurisdictions to make sure that there is outreach, education, and enforcement available. And there are a number of groups that are really good doing it, including the Human Rights Commissions, of whom I talked to most of them. So we also heard, interestingly, outreach has been discussed by most of you and others, that people aren't getting the word, and it could be a result of COVID, which certainly didn't help, but we need people to do the outreach so tenants know where to turn. Certainly, people with disabilities need to have this affordable housing opportunities. They're very vulnerable, and we'd like to see far more permanent supportive housing. And there are different financing methods, Section 202, Section 811, home CDBG, et cetera. But we would also, like public housing authorities to consider and to adopt admission preferences for people that are institutionalized or have left institutions, because they are the most vulnerable. They are the ones you're seeing on the street, and they're the ones that need the support. Finally, not finally, because it's going to be hundreds of pages, but finally, the last recommendation is to, I would say universally, to look at existing laws and see where we can't be more creative in addressing some of the solutions as a region. I think the COG is so well positioned to act as a leader in this. They've already been a leader and stepped up to the plate. So as we look at maybe pooling resources for, let's say, a right to counsel program jurisdictionally, or pooling resources for maybe a larger housing trust fund, or pooling resources and having COG take the lead on making sure that protected classes have affordable housing opportunities and rights that some of us take for granted. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. And are we going to have is Jared on to say anything?
I am on, and I appreciate the opportunity to share. Next slide, please. The national perspectives on regional fair housing plans and collaborations and some best practices. As Leslie mentioned, there are sort of three phases of this affirmatively furthering fair housing planning. It's pre-2015, 2015 to 18, and then 2018 to present. A common theme across all of those three periods is that very few regions have engaged in fair housing planning. And the reasons why so few jurisdictions have collaborated are many. Fair housing planning is a very challenging process, and it is incredibly sensitive. The planning process, it analyzes power from a historical perspective, as well as who historically has managed and controlled the power and how that control has manifested and impacted residents disproportionately. Consequently, folks view the components of fair housing planning as deeply personal. In 2018, when the Trump administration suspended the rule, we've seen even fewer jurisdictions, regions that have followed through with the fair housing planning. This process in particular stands out to me because of the comprehensive nature of it and the intensely collaborative process. So having Urban Institute at the table as a nationally recognized leader in economic and social policy research, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, a nationally recognized civil rights advocacy organization, Ochoa Urban Collective with their extensive experience and the intentionality around their community engagement process. There is a community advisory committee that's at the table that consists of over 20 organizations working regionally that are committed to providing services and increasing access to equitable opportunity for our neighbors who have experienced inequitable access to opportunity based on race, religion, color, national origin, gender, familial status, or disability. I want to commend all of the 8 jurisdictions at the table, and particularly Hillary's leadership, the regional commitment to collaboration that recognize that fair housing issues like segregation and access to opportunity and housing needs does not end at jurisdictional boundaries. And in fact, local policies can counteract or exacerbate housing issues or challenges in neighboring jurisdictions. The data confirms that the impacts of the historical policies, programs, laws, and practices enacted by the public sector historically at the local, state, federal levels, and also by individuals, neighborhoods, and various industries, continue to persist in every community across the region. So the disparities that have been created through those intentional actions must be addressed through equally intentional policies, programs, laws, and practices. And as your jurisdictions prepare for the release of the draft for public comment and public hearings, it is important that city staff and jurisdictional leadership think through the questions and concerns that you anticipate residents raising through this process. I'm going to share a quote with you from Herbert Spencer. "The wise man must remember that while he is a descendant of the past, he is a parent of the future." We individually and collectively have responsibilities as parents of the future to approach decision-making with the same intentionality we use in raising our children. I'd like you all to think about the regional housing equity plan as a call to action and draw on the framing from a new narrative for housing, the playbook for the greater Washington region as you prepare for public comment and public hearings. Those 3 tenets were understand the people and why we are trying to mobilize and what motivates them to action. Make clear messaging recommendations from the research, which we have. Help people deploy the recommendations in their own narratives. There's much to learn from the playbook that was created on framing and messaging and powerful problem solving and how to focus that energy. I encourage folks to go back and revisit that. But as I close, I want to say that a best practice to consider is a public demonstration of support across sectors. Having the public sector with support from the private sector, and in this case, Association of Realtors and property management entities, and the nonprofit advocacy community will strengthen the presentation of this. It'll strengthen your position. The Regional Housing Equity Plan analyzes the past and present, but it is a forward-looking document with data and community goals and strategies that will support a more equitable region. So I encourage jurisdictional staff and elected officials to maintain the focus identified in the playbook for Greater Washington region on a more equitable future. This document, when rolled out, will raise up those future champions and encourage them, motivate them, and inspire them to pursue positions like yours to lead the region to an even more equitable future generations down the road. So I appreciate the opportunity to share with you, and I think Hillary is going to talk through next steps.
Thanks again so much, Jared, there. I just want to recap very quickly on the project timeline and make sure that everyone is clear about future opportunities to weigh in and help inform this process. So we anticipate the full regional plan, including draft goals and strategies for local governments and for the region, should be available for public comment during April and May. Once comments have been received and incorporated, we will work to conclude the local approval processes during June and submit the final plan to HUD in July. We hope you will continue to share ways for residents in the region to provide input, improve it, and create a plan that has an opportunity to become a national model for regional fair housing planning. The plan will be posted on COG's website and on each participating government's website along with other public facilities as well. Thank you again for your time and attention. We'd appreciate hearing your input on the draft regional goals and answer any questions that you may have now.
Thank you, Ms. Chapman. And so, colleagues, since our time is somewhat limited, I know that there's lots of themes that were brought up by Leslie, by Diane, and Jared, but if we could focus our comments at this point in time to the 5 draft goals. I don't think we had a summary slide for all 5 in one place, but if you could provide any comments on those 5 goals: more housing supply, land use strategies, preservation, outreach and education, and then finally, integration for persons with disabilities. We'd love to have that conversation now. And again, the hands function, gesticulate, or use the chat. I see Ms. Gross, please.
Thank you. There was dead silence there. I was beginning to be a little concerned. Wanted to sort of ask a question, make a comment about preservation. Probably 15 years ago, Fairfax County embarked on a 1,000 apartments preserved in a matter of a couple of years. Jerry Connolly was our chairman at the time, and we did a lot of work with some of the complexes that were beginning to mature and were ready for market rate, and we achieved our goal way in advance. But it's 15 years or more later. The housing stock that might be available for a similar effort is probably is old. These are really old buildings. Some of them built in the in the early 50s. So is it better to try to preserve an old, out of date apartment complex, or buy it out, tear it down, and start all over again? And I think you could probably, there are pluses and minuses in both. A large one is displacement. And anytime we're going to do anything that is taking existing housing and improving it or changing it or whatever, needs to have a plan for displacement of those tenants and how when they can move back. But really, is some of our housing stock becoming so old that it's really not worth looking at it to maintain it and preserve it in its in its current condition, or just sort of say we got to start over again? That's my question. It's really the age of our housing stock.
Thank you, Ms. Gross. So I'll leave it to, I don't know who wants to take that. Just go right ahead.
Jared, jump in. I mean, I think it depends, and I hate to give that like wishy-washy answer, but we've seen a number of projects receive tax credits to completely redo them, and they're quite nice, I might add. Others will never be okay. They're so obsolete that they're sort of unfixable. So it really does depend. Some of the housing stock was built far better back then than now. So it's very situational. Jared, do you have thoughts on that?
I agree with you, Diane, and it's a cop-out, but it depends. It depends on the cost. It depends on the impact. It depends on the funding sources that are available. And I'm going to throw in there the cultural significance. If this is considered a cultural asset in the neighborhood, and it does cost more to preserve it as is than to tear it down and rebuild, but it has that level of significance to the neighborhood, then maybe that's what needs to be done or should be done. But it really depends on lots of factors, and it's difficult for us without looking at it and engaging in the community to make that determination from our seats.
I wanted to chime in and add on to about, you have to have a plan in place to look at your community. You need to be doing a market analysis of the neighborhoods as you look forward to plan your development. And so, you know, Jared touched on some of the points, like, is there cultural significance? Is this a historical site? We know if you're going to go back and retrofit, you know, in some cases, it may be cheaper, yes, to actually start over and do new construction, but you have to think about the significance to the community, the impact, the housing stock, right? What kind of housing is it? You know, what are the actual costs? So you need to be doing your cost benefit analysis from a development standpoint, and then looking at all the available resources to you. Are you going to leverage this where, you know, this is private property, you work out a deal through a land disposition agreement to reduce your costs, and, you know, working together with your community. So I know for us in DC, you know, our situation is different. We don't have the same amount of land to actually be developed as some of the surrounding counties and towns. So you have to know your community. You have to do that market analysis. You need to be working with your Office of Planning and Zoning to know what you can do within the restrictions that you have. And of course, once you put federal money and even the local money, you do have to comply with the Uniform Relocation Act. So your baseline is you're going to have a plan for relocation to address any kind of displacement. And you definitely want to be on the front end with the community, as we've seen on national level and a local level. I know, see Jared smiling, I see some cases coming to mind to everyone in the community. We've seen these cases where people were not engaged early on in the development process in their community, so they do not feel attached to that development, and you're going to have community resistance that can drag on for years and go through lawsuits that will impact your time frame and end up costing you actually more money. So I would say, are you looking to revitalize? Make sure you have a charrette process in place to work with the community.
Thank you. And I will say, Ms. Gross, we've had some success in those cases where buildings needed to go, but we wanted to avoid even temporary displacement, understanding that tends to lead to permanent displacement. You know, we've been able to work with developers to do phased approaches so that you take down, or I'm sorry, you allow a part of the property, if it's many garden apartment complexes, allow that to get to a rate where natural vacancies are not filled, so that you can take a parcel, you can, you know, build a multi-unit building while keeping everybody else in place and proceeding with a phased development approach. Takes longer, it's more expensive, but at least we found that's a more preferable alternative than needing to deal with the impact of wholesale displacement of communities. So,
And Christian, if I may add, and that
absolutely.
should be, that displacement plan should be something that is there from the get-go. It's really
Absolutely.
amazing the number of people you talk to when you say, what about the tenants that are there now? And they go, oh,
Yeah,
I hadn't
exactly.
thought about that. So that really has to be something from the very beginning. in the
Amen.
discussion. Thank you.
Great discussion. Okay, we'll now move to Mayor Newton.
Thank you, Chair, and to follow along with Ms. Gross and her concerns about, you know, the displacement. We have several situations in the city of Rockville where we have beautiful garden apartments. They were built well, they have parquet floors. They're built better than some of the things that are happening now in many places. And so we've just had this conversation back this summer when we were doing our comprehensive plan, and we are preserving, especially 1 and 2 of them, because they are built well. And what we learned during COVID was how important it is to have outdoor balconies, to have more than 1 room. And these garden apartments are 2 and 3 bedroom with balconies. So it gives people, you know, more space, more air. And I think that's something that we need to think about going forward. I remember a couple years ago when developers would come to the city and they wanted to just build micro units. And that was the whole big thing. Oh, everybody wants to live in this 400 square feet. And some of us were like, well, wait a minute, who wants to? And boy, did we learn during COVID that that actually isn't true at all. So I think we need to take a good hard look at preserving, and as what Jared said, and I'm sorry I don't have your last name, but your point is exactly right. It is individual situations. You can't just have a blanket policy because some of the older apartments are better than the new, but some aren't. And so we need to be very careful not to put a blanket protection for those that don't allow the upgrades. And we're trying to do that in the city. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Newton. And thank you also, Vice Chair Stewart. She's put it in the chat, but to verbally articulate, if you need to reference the actual goals, they're included in summary form on page 23 of the board packet. Thank you, Ms. Stewart.
And Mr. Chair, I apologize. I meant to start out by saying I do support the goals. The city of Rockville does support the goals. I'm sorry, I forgot that. Thank you.
Oh, that's appreciate that. Appreciate that. Any other questions or comments on the goals or any other element of the presentation? Am I generally on track to assume that people think these goals are right? They're inclusive of the right areas of focus? Okay, great. I'd actually like to bring up an issue, and Diane, as you talked about some of the possible ways that we could think about increasing supply. You know, it struck me that one of the tools that all of us have is of course density. Density is a great tool that we all have that's all under the domain of public officials, yet we deal with communities that often believe that since density is publicly owned, they as a member of the public get the right to determine how it's used. So this is really a question about any tips or tools that any of you may have for you know, having that conversation. We've done some work as a COG board on messaging and narratives around housing, but we'd love to get your take if you've had any success with how people have been able to engage their communities in constructive conversations about how density is a key tool in delivering positive housing results. All right, seems like it's too challenging for anybody to take on. We'll leave it at that.
So, Mr. Dorsey, I will say that in DC about 2 years ago, the Office of Planning did do a lot of work around the comprehensive plan. And so they went out into lots of communities and they did get feedback. You know, as Jared mentioned earlier, every community is different. So I think you have to socialize people to what the options are. And then, of course, you need to speak to them in plain language, right? You can't talk to them in zoning terms. You can't talk to them in the same way that we're all speaking together because, you know, they're members of the public, the community, and they don't know all the acronyms the way that we do. So even mentioning the term density may not mean the same to them as it means to us. So I think that one of the biggest things that Jared mentioned, again, I'll say it, is community engagement and outreach. You know, this is all about people living together and people want to feel part of their neighborhood. So I would say to anyone, before you try to move forward on any public initiatives, especially regarding housing, as we've seen in the last few years, or schools, you need to get input from your community. That's my 2 cents.
And just as an editorial comment, Jared, I really loved your perspective or your framing of we all stand as descendants of prior generations, but parents of future ones, as a way to maybe have that conversation. You know, our responsibility to make room for those who come after us and not to close communities so that they will not have the ability to participate. So I'll at least take that as a way of something that I might try in these, you know, sometimes sticky conversations about how we think about land use and changes in density. So thank you all. Any other questions or comments for our expert team here on the Fair Housing Project? Well, great. I think we can sum that up as you all have the license to believe that these draft goals are the right ones. And we appreciate your extensive outreach and inclusion of the respected jurisdictions and look forward to seeing this all come together and be wrapped up for our consideration later. So thank you very much, Diane and Leslie and Jared, and of course, Hillary, for this exciting work and the progress that you have made to date. We'll now transition to our last housing item of the day, and we are going to now hear from our regional planner at COG, John Kent, who is going to brief us on the multifamily rental housing construction indicators report. I'll turn it over to John, and then hopefully we'll have a few minutes for questions once he's concluded.
Thank you, Chairman Dorsey. Good afternoon. My name is John Kent, and I am a regional planner with the Department of Community Planning and Services. So this presentation is on the findings of the Multifamily Rental Housing Construction Indicators Report, which was published last November. The data and analysis excludes all owner-occupied housing units, condos and co-ops, even if sublet. Single-family rental housing and projects with fewer than 4 units are also excluded. The report focuses on the size and number of completed projects, trends in the industry and around the region, and average rents. To give some perspective on this report, this pie chart shows American Housing Survey data for the shares of housing by type and tenure. Note that this data is for the Washington metropolitan area, not the COG region. Most housing units are owner-occupied, and a little less than half are detached single-family houses. This presentation focuses on the dark green slice. About 20% of households live in multifamily rental units. For COG jurisdictions, the share is presumably a bit higher. And in terms of recent construction, multifamily rentals make up a much bigger percentage. Exact data for recent construction is hard to come by because it doesn't reach the census's minimum threshold for privacy. But the American Housing Survey and housing permit data suggest multifamily rentals represent around 40 to 50% of new units over the past decade. I will discuss the data from the report and how it relates to the regional housing targets set in 2019. The first target is to add 320,000 housing units over the next 10 years. The multifamily rental sector is only a part of the total housing market, of course. This graph from the report shows the new multifamily rental units added in our region over the past 30 years. It is for the COG region. In 2020, 14,269 units were added by the multifamily rental sector, about 45% of the annual target set by the COG board. New construction has declined 19% from the peak in 2014, but the 119,350 new multifamily rental units built since 2011 are the most of any 10-year period in nearly 50 years. Here, recent construction is broken down by building style. The market has seen a trend away from garden-style apartments, shown in purple, and towards mid-rise apartments below 10 stories, shown in dark blue. Wooden frame, stick-built construction has become more prevalent, and recent innovations have increased how high this lower-cost form of construction can go. And the trend now broken down by number of bedrooms in a unit. We see studios in blue, 1 bedrooms in orange, 2 bedrooms in purple, 3 bedrooms in green, and barely visible 4 or more bedrooms in red. There has been a significant increase in studio and 1-bedroom construction since the beginning of the century, particularly in the central jurisdictions of DC, Arlington, and Alexandria. This map from page 6 of the report shows new apartment units completed in 2020 in red, and those built in prior years in beige. Each dot represents 20 units. We can see that new construction was highly clustered, primarily in the core and near Metro Rail stations, with 72% inside the Beltway. Our second regional housing target is to locate 3/4 of new housing inside an activity center or near a high-capacity transit station. The areas in yellow on this map are activity centers or are areas within a half-mile walk to one of the region's 199 high-capacity transit stations. Looking at construction, we see that 90% of construction in 2020 was within these areas, exceeding the level set by the second housing goal. Darker red dots are the units inside the target areas built in 2020. Much less numerous, and therefore barely visible, are the dark blue dots, showing new units outside of an activity center and not near high-capacity transit. The lighter colors are existing units built before 2020. 60% of existing units are either inside an activity center or near a high-capacity transit station. Looking at the 30-year construction trend in activity centers and high-capacity transit station areas, we see that the share inside these areas is increasing. Multifamily rental apartments have met or exceeded the standard from the second housing goal in each of the last 10 years. Our third regional housing target is that 3/4 of new housing be affordable to low and middle income households. Rents are high compared to incomes of typical renters, but inflation-adjusted rents have not risen appreciably over the past 20 years. In 2020, overall average rents fell sharply due to the pandemic. 2021 data are not included in the report, but rents fully rebounded to pre-pandemic levels in 2021. I summarized the key findings from our report here. The multifamily sector is well matched with COG's housing targets, especially in the accessibility goal. Apartment construction is proceeding at its highest pace in decades, and rents, while high, have not outpaced inflation and have risen less rapidly than home values. Thank you for the opportunity to present.
Mr. Kent, thank you so very much. Great analysis and wonderful and concise report. A lot of interesting takeaways. Are there any questions or comments from Mr. Kent that board members have at this time? Shy and retiring group today. I'm shocked. But I will say it struck me, Mr. Kent, as somewhat surprising that the rental market has actually fairly well tracked the rise in the cost of living over time. That where we've so been incredibly challenged is in the ownership market, and stark to see that.
I agree.
All right. Well, on that, I think I will conclude this item, last chance. And I will ask you, board colleagues, if anyone has any other business that they would like to propose that the COG board hear this afternoon. Hearing none, before we leave, as a public service announcement, I think some of you know, but I'm not sure all of you do, that Monica Nunez, who very much supports the work of this board, has added to her family with a second son. So when we next see Monica, her family will have, I guess, increased by a third, if I'm doing the math correctly. So it's on that great item that I am pleased to remind everyone that we are intending for our March meeting for us to join together, in person. That date is March 9th. We will stay in contact. You'll hear from COG staff if that plan continues, but we hope to be in the same room again. And if the weather outside today is any indication, hopefully it will be nice to be out and about at that time. Seeing as though there are no other hands for other business, I would entertain at this point a motion for us to adjourn.
Moved.
It has been moved.
Second.
Is there a second?
Second.
It has been seconded. All in favor? Everyone. Let's go and have a good time. Thanks, everybody.
Stay safe, everyone.
You too.
Bye.